Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Middle East in the winter of 2024 is testimony to the old mix of change and continuity. Most basic actors and factors were around a year ago and much earlier, but there are also new elements such as the Gaza War, the Hezbollah-Israel Campaign, the Houthi and Pro-Iranian Iraqi militias challenges, and the American counteroffensive of sorts in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. So what is the geopolitical map of the region right now, and what are the scenarios likely to take it forward or backward? To help us analyze it, we're joined from the Kingdom of the Netherlands by the former Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, namely Professor Uri Rosenthal. It's good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is a project director on Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, who formerly served as the Director General of the Israeli Ministry for Strategic Affairs, as well as the head of the IDF's Intelligence Directorate Research and Assessment Division. Thank you for joining us as well, General.
Hi, good to be with you.
With us in the studio, of course, our TV7 Editor-at-Large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you tell us about the latest in this long sequence of developments throughout this region? And please set a stage for us.
Well, as you know, all of us Mid-Easterners have a tendency to believe that this is the center of the world, if not of the universe. And maybe in biblical times it was. But we have to be more modest and know that even though many of the wars started here, even recently, our fate is probably dependent on outside events, outside actors. Very shortly, we will mark the third anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war, following 2 years of fighting. The United States believes that China, as it calls it, a near-peer competitor, is the most dangerous nation because it could attack Taiwan. And in the United States itself, exactly 9 months from now, there will be a presidential election, along with many congressional elections, the entire House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate. And these are all events with implications for the region. And therefore, the geostrategic outline here is dependent on what we, Israelis, Arabs, Iranians are doing, but also, and perhaps even before, we should analyze the impact of great power involvement in what is happening here. And on that account, perhaps the most important event this week has been Secretary of State Blinken's visit to the area, even though it was only one of half dozen visits by him, one of which was with President Biden at the very start of the Gaza War. Nevertheless, because Blinken met with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority, perhaps he will come back to his master, to President Biden, with a more realistic view of what is feasible in the Middle East, whether they should strive for some progress even before the elections, or perhaps they should wait out this year and see in November whether Biden was reelected or whether his Republican challenger is coming to the White House or coming back to the White House, because it seems that barring a decision by the US Supreme Court, Donald Trump will be the Republican challenger.
I highly doubt that the Supreme Court would intervene in this case, but that's already A different question altogether, but let's now turn to Professor Rosenthal. I'd like to ask you from the external precipice to the various intricacies in the Middle East. Naturally, everything is interconnected, and external forces, as Mr. Oren, have no little sway over the various developments in this region. Nonetheless, it's merely one factor, or a multitude of factors implicating other multitude of factors within this region. From your perspective, please set a stage for us.
Amir actually has already been very straightforward in his statement that although, of course, the Middle East is pivotal, it's not the whole story. And when I look at the three main theaters, which are also of great concern to the United States, they are not only Middle East, but of course also Ukraine, Russia, and the Pacific, Taiwan. And here, my picture is as follows. When we look at the powers that be in the world scene, I would say that we definitely see, on the one hand, of course, the Western side, which is not completely territorial because it also includes countries like Japan and South Korea, and of course down under, Australia, New Zealand. But we also have, on the other hand, this kind of amalgam of autocratic regimes, which consist of course, China number one, Russia more or less number two, and North Korea number three. And I say it deliberately in this way because by now I would put Iran somewhere ex equo with Russia. Iran is now a superpower and talking the big things and also the concrete things right at this moment. It's quite intriguing that I heard that Iran is now planning a fourth nuclear plant in Isfahan, and to look at the way in which things are associated and linked, it immediately pops up in my mind the fact that when we were talking about the rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia had actually two preconditions. One was, of course, the Palestinian issue per se, but the second one was that Saudi Arabia was pretty keen on getting support for the development of nuclear energy on its soil. So there you see how things are linked. Allow me to make a few other remarks in the elaborating on the world scene. I heard the very uncomfortable phrase from one of the US experts, which was that one of the main problems in the world at the moment is, he called it literally US versus US. US being divided to the bottom. And this is an uncomfortable idea. When we talk about Russia and Ukraine, there is a deadlock, more or less, which is of great concern also on the European end. And when we look at China, we see that the Chinese are trying to be a little bit moderate, for instance, on in their influence on Iran, but it is just a pure matter of direct commercial interests on their part. China and Russia and Iran are strategically by now linked closely, and North Korea is, of course, a very unpleasant actor to be added to this autocratic axis of more, some of them we would call even some to be part of an axis of evil, to use this Bush-like term.
Well, General Kuperwasser, I'd like to ask you, since if I rewind a little bit and I'll go to the administration after the Bush administration, namely the Obama administration, two key elements ultimately recalibrated the Middle East. Namely, the first one is the policy of leading from behind, so to speak, which the Biden administration pursued in taking a back seat and letting its partners and allies contend with the challenges that each one of them had to face on their own. And then the second is a statement by the then Secretary of State under the Obama presidency, namely Hillary Clinton, who proclaimed the pivot eastward to the Pacific to contend with the near-peer nation, namely China, which caused a reaction by regional actors to start hedging their interests and prepare for the worst, namely a disembarking or disengagement from the region, and to reallocate the majority of funding to contend with that threat, even though the rivalry, in essence, is of strategic power competition, which in essence is global, and therefore the Middle East did not wait for any pivot and started to see the Chinese bolstering their regional interests, seeing the Russians increasing their interest also in the region. And we're seeing somewhat of a derivative thereof today, where the region is in a much worse place than it ever has been in the last 2 decades at least.
I think that, in fact, there is no vacuum. And because of that, once the Americans even began thinking about pivoting away from the Middle East, the other forces came in, and China was amongst them, and Russia as well. And they were trying to take advantage of this idea of the Americans of pivoting out. And that was what we are experiencing now is in a part a result of that development, because you cannot discount the Middle East as a major area of that has an impact on the way the world operates and behaves, because the force that we have in the Middle East, the Islamic forces, radical Islamist forces like Iran, and especially Iran, have a vision and a mission in their mind of changing the world. And they are committed to do that with cooperation with other forces that are less ideological, but also are committed to changing the world order, especially China and Russia. And this is how this cooperation and alliance between Iran, Russia, and China, and together with, as Uri said, together with North Korea to some extent, is operating in order to change the world order. And the Americans do understand the importance of the game, but they try again and again to look at the Middle East as a minor arena. But this is not going to work. And we see what's happening now with the Houthis and the Iraqi militias that operate under Iranian control, trying to challenge the American policy and trying to force America to understand that it is going to get involved in a war in the Middle East, whether it likes it or not. And that is the situation we are experiencing now. The Americans, even after losing 3 soldiers, were trying to convince themselves that they can retaliate without being dragged into a wider scale war in the Middle East. I don't think that the Houthis and the Iranians, as a matter of fact, are going to allow it to happen. They are going to put more pressure on the Americans, because once you deliver the message that you are uninterested in getting involved in a war, that's a sign of weakness that's going to be used by the Iranians. And the Iranians are very good at using the bigger powers for promoting their interests. The cooperation with the Russians is very deep. So is the cooperation with China and even with North Korea. And they leverage these countries for promoting their interests. And as long as they have something to give in order to get something in return, this is going to work. And they have a lot to give. They have a lot to give in the sense that they can help militarily the Russians in Ukraine. They can have a lot to give in the sense that they can cause damage to the Americans in the Middle East. And all of that is being used by these axes in order to change the world order. Much is going to be decided, of course, by the policy of the United States. And in this respect, elections in the States are going to be detrimental for the future of the world and the future of the Middle East as well.
Before the elections, however, let's say, hypothetically, we just had our last Jerusalem studio panel on Iran's nuclear program. Let's say that a month before the elections, the Iranians, hypothetically, and this is not an unlikely scenario, would conduct a nuclear test. What then?
Well, the next day you will see an Israeli strike on their facilities because a nuclear test does not mean that they already have a nuclear device. But let's look at the US Navy and the asymmetrical competition with much lesser powers. As you know, navies always trained for the big battle like Tsushima, Midway, and after World War II, to their chagrin, no such battle occurred. There was no US Navy versus Soviet Navy clash. So they had to change their doctrine, and the new doctrine was called from the sea, projecting power, whether by missiles, planes, or marines, from the sea into some land scenario. President Biden remarkably sent two aircraft carrier task forces to the Eastern Mediterranean into the Persian Gulf. This is a lot of firepower. But look at the Houthis. Without a navy, they are shooting at naval targets, at vessels trying to transit Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden. They are launching missiles and drones from their land positions. Yes, the US is retaliating, but the entire might of the US Navy, both surface and submarine, is not enough to deter them. So the whole notion of what is power in the 21st century has to be reassessed.
Well, naturally, tools require also intent, but Professor Rosenthal?
Amir, Oren is talking about power, and may I add perhaps a somewhat surprising addition to his message. I'm intrigued by the fact that by now we see a lot of non-state actors exercising power in all these arenas. I'm talking proxies on the part of Iran. I'm talking organized crime, which is completely mixed up with it. I'm talking NGOs, which have an increasing influence on the public mood throughout the world. I'm talking, of course, corporate actors. And what is striking me is that, for instance, Iran, there we go again, is utilizing these non-state actors in a very, very efficient and, if I may say, also sometimes effective way. Just to give you a few examples, of course, the proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, the militias in Iraq and Syria, but also the way in which they play their game with regard to NGOs with which they have a sort of macabre kind of relation when it is about, believe it or not, human rights, etc., in the Gaza War thing. And so it is not just the states which are covering the world scene, but also these non-state actors. And let me add one very intriguing factor here too. When we look at, for instance, Latin America, Iran is exercising influence there, through organized crime linkages. But at the same time, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard has now its quite some people around in Latin America and Venezuela. So the picture is not only one of states, but it's also non-state actors which play their part in the world at the moment.
Indeed. General Kuperwasser?
Well, I'm very concerned about the change, the turn that can happen if the Iranians decide to move forward with their military nuclear program. They have made all the preparations to be able to equip themselves not with only one or two or three nuclear devices, but they can produce within a very short period of time something like 5 or 6. And this is something that is very concerning, because we were talking all along this conversation about Iran as a partner in this coalition of forces that want to change the world order. But of course, once you have the combination of this mission sense that the Iranians have, of the commitment to change the world for Islamists reasons, and the capability to back it with nuclear capability, that's something of a different magnitude. And we see that the Iranians are ignoring the international monitoring and the international concerns about what they're doing, and resume the fast accumulation of the production of highly enriched uranium up to 60%. This is nobody does that just for the fun of it. With everything that's happening around, there is reason to be concerned that the Iranians may move in this direction. Now, nobody knows how long it's going to take them to move from the production of fissile material to having a bomb. But we have to learn one thing from the 7th of October debacle, and that is that we shouldn't be underestimating the threats that we are facing. And even if we don't know something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it's I'm very concerned about this potential eventuality. And I'm more even concerned with the fact that this is not going to be blocked by China and Russia because of this close cooperation, even though they say that they are against it. On the contrary, they may, in one way or another, help Iranians to move forward in this direction. And this is something that is a major concern for Israel, and that Amir said that we shall attack once it happens. The Iranians will produce more than one. This was their original plan, to have 5 of them. And we have to be very concerned about this potential. The Americans say they are not going to let it happen, but their commitment not to get involved in a wide-scale war in the Middle East tells you that you should be very careful about building on this commitment of the Americans. And we are in a bad situation right now, but in a very complicated situation right now. But this is going to be much more complicated if the Iranians decide to go in this direction.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and we'll give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing analysis. But Mr. Oren, you wanted to react?
Yes, that General Kuperwasser and the two of us live in Israel, and obviously Israel has enough problems with its neighbors. But what about Professor Rosenthal's neighbors, the ICJ and the ICC? This is also a front or two fronts with which Israel has to contend.
You're talking about South Africa and...
South Africa was the trigger, but the problem now lies with the court.
Maybe it may trigger them also to get their crosshairs on Malema and about the Boer, but that's already a different question. Professor Rosenthal.
I would merely say that this is some sort of a gracious matter that we have these two courts on our soil in The Hague. The provisionary measures on the part of the ICJ were based on a very biased evidence, which shows that the ICJ in any case is completely embedded in the UN framework, which is biased against Israel. Now, one other point about Iran, I can't see it any way different from the fact that we see here a pure rehearsal, in a way, of an ongoing process. When I was a Minister of Foreign Affairs in the cabinet in the Netherlands in 2011 and 2012, we had this story exactly as we have it now, only at the moment it is much more in a burning kind of theater. In 2011, 2012, I remember we were not that far off of a US operation vis-a-vis Iran. And it looks as if at the moment the Biden administration is even more restrained in a lot of things in this respect. And I would say that here again, you could say that the US by itself is at a seriously critical junction with regard to its whole appearance in the world. I saw a piece by Niall Ferguson, the American historian, who actually which his story actually amounted to the well-known phrase in Latin, but I will say it in English: if you want peace, prepare for war. We are in a sphere of appeasement, and that doesn't feel very nicely at this moment.
General Kuperwasser, you have 20 seconds.
So I want to say one word about it. And this is that the idea that the recipe to solve all these problems is to force on Israel a two-state solution that would allow the Palestinian terror groups to rule all of the Palestinian territories is a wrong approach and a very dangerous one.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Professor Rosenthal, General Kuperwasser, and Mr. Oren, and to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update. Shalom.